Welcome to In Conversation with Tibettv. This is Sakina Bhatt. For today's episode, we have a guest who was awarded the 2014 Mirha Sinha Bhattacharjee Award instituted by the Institute of Chinese Studies for the best paper titled Economic Liberalization in China's Tibet and its Impact on State-Society Relationship. He has a PhD in Chinese Studies and is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science in the University of Calcutta. He is Dr. Jigme Yeshi. Welcome to the show, Jigmila. It's very nice to have you here.
Thank you so much.
So, Jigmila, you were an activist and an academic during your college time. So, how did you strike a balance between the two roles?
Well, I guess initially it was difficult to strike a balance, and I used to miss a number of classes. My attendance was low because in Delhi University attendance matters a lot. But still, I used to manage in my own way with regard to activism and with regard to going for classes and trying to get whatever marks is required.
Now you are an assistant professor, so do you have time for activism?
Now activism, it's more in terms of creating awareness about Tibet in the class or talking about Tibet in academic conferences in different universities like in the Northeast. For instance, in Guwahati University, I presented a paper a couple of months back, and Jadavpur have already presented papers on Tibet as a factor in India and China relationship. So I feel that awareness should also be there on the academic line.
Okay, so right now you just mentioned that you talk about Tibet in your class, but then most of the students in your class must be people who are Indians. So how receptive are they?
Initially, they don't know much about Tibet, about the issue of Tibet, about what has happened inside Tibet and what is happening in Tibet. They know that there are a group of people known as Tibetans, and I teach in Calcutta. So Calcutta is very close to Gangtok as well as to Darjeeling. And Darjeeling has a sizable Tibetan community, as well as Gangtok and the other places they do have, like Kalimpong and all. In that way, what happens is they know about the people, about the custom, about the food, but they don't know about what has actually happened, and they don't know about the history of how during the colonial period it was actually the British who had formulated India's Tibet policy, which is still seen to be continuing. They start with some kind of skepticism about things. They don't know much. Initially it changes and then they become more and more receptive.
So you have presented on Tibet a number of times at national and international conferences. So how receptive are the audiences when it comes to topics relating to Tibet?
Most of the conferences I've presented, these conferences were related to Tibet. For instance, in Norway, I made a presentation in the International Association for Tibetan Studies, as well as in Texas, in University of Texas in Austin, in the States. I presented on a paper on Tibet, democracy in Tibet, the exiled democracy, and the conference was a Himalaya conference. So in that way, some degree of knowledge they do have. But then there are certain conferences, like say for example the conference organized by the ICS, for which I received the award which you mentioned a while back. That particular conference, of course they know about Tibet, but still it's more to do with Chinese studies. And then I also presented a few papers in conferences that specifically focus on China. And over there, their curiosity, they know about Tibet because they have studied about Tibet, but then the curiosity and their ideas about awareness about Tibet I guess it grows. Tibetan academicians who are here in India or abroad should enter into these conferences that specifically deal with China and emphasize on Tibet from an academic point of view, not from an activist point of view.
So what draws their interest in your research?
Maybe like many of them are fascinated with Tibet. Maybe they just know one side of the Tibetan story. And in many cases, it is mostly this idea of exoticizing Tibet, about Tibetan Buddhism, because you have huge number of Westerners as well as people from other countries being drawn to Tibetan Buddhism and especially to His Holiness's teachings. But then we Tibetans are like any other human society, like any other human community. We cannot generalize Tibetans all as being filled with compassion and all as Buddhists. There are, like for instance, you have Tibetan Muslims. Right? Then there are, say for example, some Tibetans, few Tibetans who have converted to Christianity. So in that way, what happens is this multiplicity, this pluralism I try to bring about. And then I try to bring about the kind of a dynamism that is there present between Tibetans and the whole Himalayan community. And in India, many of them, they don't know much about the Tibet issue. So that piques their interest. And also what I generally try to do in my presentation is I try to bring about the more human aspect about Tibet. How in one sense Tibet and Tibetans, they are not only community and a people that are strongly compassionate, or they are Buddhist, or they have this, what do you call it, ideas about this exoticization of Tibet. And not only on that, but also I focus on the diversity that is present among the Tibetan community inside Tibet as well as in exile. For instance, the Tibetan Muslims, you yourself belong to that community, right? Even there are a few Christians among the Tibetans, maybe a handful, not much. But this diversity becomes important because overall we are also like any other human society. We are just like any other human being.
In 2016, you had edited a book titled Changes on the Roof of the World, Reflections on Tibet. So what is the highlight of the book, and what impact does it bring in addressing the climate change in Tibet?
It's a book that it's an edited volume. So most of the contributors are scholars. They are young scholars, Tibetan as well as those who consider themselves to be ethnically Tibetan. So what happens in that way is that it's actually the voices from the younger upcoming academic group. That is one highlight, what I feel. Second thing is it is meant more for an Indian audience, because as we've mentioned about climate change, the person who has written about climate change is Lobsang Yangso, who is doing her PhD on the impact of climate change and with regard to the environment inside Tibet and its impact on India. So in that way, this book brought out by Pentagon Publishers from New Delhi actually brings about this awareness.
So your research focuses on the politics in the Himalayas and also in the role of religion in the Himalayan community. So tell us something about the research and the key findings.
Okay, well, initially my research started with, I still look into that. It's not that I'm completely focused on religion in politics in the Himalayas and the impact of religion on it. Initially, I focused mostly on China's policies in Tibet, especially from the point of view of legitimacy. And I tried looking at how do they gain hegemony inside Tibet, rule through consent. Over there, what I found out was they were seen to be incorporating a lot of religious elites, a lot of tukus and reincarnated lamas into the ruling structure. For instance, the best example being the previous Penjan Lama, which becomes very, very important. And then I realized that Tibetan Buddhism has a very strong influence. And my Pala always used to tell me about these monks who were actually leaders in their own regions. The monasteries, they used to have immense amount of political power, political influence. Now with the coming of the nation state, that changes. But still, Raymond Williams has written a wonderful notion known as the residual formations. And it's this residual formations that I'm interested in. How do the modern co-opt the traditional? And that is something which I tend to see in the context of the Himalayas, in the context of especially the monasteries and the religious institutions spread all over the Himalayas. My later project which I want to pursue will be mapping this particular impact, or mapping this particular notion all the way from Ladakh till Tawang. Right now, currently, I am planning to handle a project on the impact of these monasteries and especially the religious elites on local politics, as well as not only local politics but on socio-cultural, economic issues, especially in the Darjeeling Hills.
You are also looking at the Sino-Tibetan relationship.
Yes.
So what do you think about the prospects of the resumption of this Sino-Tibetan dialogue?
Well, now I'll be a bit pessimistic with regard to this, because I guess it'll be difficult for the resumption of dialogue to happen immediately right now. Because right now what we see is China is rising, even in the field of entertainment. We see Chinese money flowing into Hollywood, and we see a lot of Chinese actors appearing in a lot of Hollywood movies. So in that way, what happens is the voice of Tibet actually gets curtailed. But then with the rise of China, and with China not becoming flexible, not becoming open inside China, till how long can the performance legitimacy that they have with the people, that is legitimacy through economic growth, how long will that last? There will be a moment when, in one sense, that kind of a legitimacy will eventually deplete. And with the depletion of that, there will be resistances, there will be, to a larger extent, a lot of revolt. And it is during that time that the Chinese might enter into a dialogue again, a negotiation again. But you never know. We are living in a very unpredictable world. There are numerous mechanisms one can adopt, whereby what the CTA is also doing, trying to reach out to the other Chinese groups or the other elites, for instance, inside China, or trying to figure out what is happening inside Tibet, not letting the Tibetans inside Tibet lose hope. Dialogue should happen between equals. Right now, Tibetans, especially the exiled Tibetans, they are not equals. We've always remained subalterns from that point of view. Much depends on the Tibetans inside Tibet. They, in one sense, have the real force. They, in one sense, have real power. We in exile and the Tibetan advocacy groups, they can simply encourage them. They can, in one sense, give them more strength. And then the biggest strength that they have is His Holiness. And His Holiness is always emphasizing on this particular idea.
So what are your plans for the future, and where do you see yourself 10 years from now?
Okay. Well, currently I want to continue in my own job right now, because I get to interact with people. It's a very, very powerful profession. But eventually I want to bring out my thesis as a book, and also I am planning to write a biography of my Pala.
Okay.
He's 93 years old, so he has a lot of stories with regard to his own land, Tau. So in that way it becomes interesting, and we need to preserve the memories of the earlier generation.
So Jigme, have you been to Tibet?
I could not go to Tibet, even though I went to Thendu about 3 or 4 years back for my field trip. But I have not been to Tibet. I would love to go, maybe in the coming years.
So Jigme, you have anything to say at the end, finally?
Well, I would like to thank Tibettv. I would like to thank you for giving me an opportunity to voice my opinions. Well, finally, what I feel is, I guess Tibetans, whether inside Tibet or in exile in the Western countries or in India or in any other part of the world, nowadays Tibetans have spread in all corners of the world, right? So we need to follow what His Holiness has said, follow the Jewish model. We see the Jews, in one sense, being one of the most resilient community, and the Jews, to a larger extent, are one of the most successful communities. The reason why they got Israel was because of their success, and the Jews could stay outside their own homeland for 2000 years, even though the homeland right now is filled with conflict, and the way that they turned into right now, it's pretty bad. But then the kind of a resiliency, the kind of a tenaciousness that the Jews they showed, that I guess needs to be emulated by us Tibetans. Albert Einstein was a Jew. We have Karl Marx was a Jew. We need more people like them in the Tibetan community, and I feel that it is eventually happening. It is growing. But I guess more needs to be done.
Okay, Jigme, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you here
Thank
today.
you.
Thank you for
so
coming
much.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching, and see you in our very next episode of In Conversation with Tibettv.